It was the summer of 1982, and the little town of Maple Creek sat quietly between long stretches of cornfields and winding dirt roads. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, where kids played outside until the streetlights came on, and where doors were often left unlocked. For the Carter family, life was simple but good. Margaret Carter, a kind woman in her late 30s, worked part-time at the local diner. Her husband, Robert, was a truck driver who spent long hours on the road, but always came home on weekends. They lived in a small white house with green shutters and a porch swing that creaked softly in the evening breeze. Their daughters, Laura and Denise, were the heart of their world. Laura was 11, quiet and thoughtful, with a love for drawing and collecting pressed flowers. Denise, just 2 years younger, was full of energy, always talking, always laughing. They were different in many ways, but the sisters were inseparable. Where one went, the other followed. That July morning began like any other. The sun had barely risen, and the air smelled of freshly cut grass. Margaret made pancakes while the girls sat at the table, talking about their plans for the day. They were going to visit their friend Jenny, who lived about a mile away. The girls often rode their bikes there, sometimes stopping by the small creek on the way to skip stones or look for frogs. Margaret kissed them both goodbye and reminded them to be home before lunch. "And stay together," she said, as she always did. The girls nodded, smiling, then pedaled off down the dirt road, their laughter fading into the morning air. It was the last time Margaret saw them. The first few hours passed without concern. It wasn't unusual for the girls to lose track of time, but by noon, when the kitchen clock ticked past 1 o'clock, Margaret started to feel uneasy. She looked out the window every few minutes, expecting to see the familiar sight of 2 bikes rolling up the drive. By 2 o'clock, she picked up the phone and called Jenny's house. Jenny's mother answered. "Oh, they left around 11, she said. They said they were heading home." Margaret's stomach tightened. She hung up and went straight outside. She checked the road, then the creek, calling their names over and over. Her voice echoed through the trees, but there was no answer. By 4 o'clock, Robert was called home from work. Within an hour, neighbors had joined the search. The sheriff's department was alerted, and soon patrol cars were driving slowly down every country road. Flashlights cut through the tall grass as night fell. Dogs barked in the distance, and the hum of crickets filled the air. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring into the darkness. Every sound made her heart jump. A car passing, a door closing, the wind rustling the trees. The next morning, deputies found both girls' bicycles near the old Miller barn, less than half a mile from home. They were lying side by side as if the girls had stopped to rest. But there was no sign of them. No footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Reporters began arriving within days. The small town was flooded with people asking questions, taking photos, filming the search efforts. Margaret didn't care about the cameras. She only wanted answers. She walked miles every day with the search teams, calling her daughters' names until her voice broke. Days turned into weeks. Flyers with the girls' faces were taped to every store window and telephone pole. The local news ran nightly updates. People volunteered from neighboring towns to help search the woods, the rivers, even old wells. But each day ended the same, with no sign of Laura or Denise. As the weeks passed, hope began to fade for everyone except Margaret. She refused to believe her daughters were gone. She told herself that maybe someone had taken them, that maybe they were somewhere safe waiting to come home. Robert, however, began to change. He stopped talking, stopped eating, and one morning he left the house and didn't return for 3 days. When he finally came back, his eyes were empty. The investigation dragged on for months. The sheriff's department followed hundreds of leads. A truck spotted near the barn, a stranger seen at a gas station, a note found in the schoolyard, but each lead went nowhere. There were no witnesses, no clues, no evidence. Margaret started visiting the church more often. Sometimes she went in the middle of the night, sitting alone in the pew, whispering prayers into the still air. She asked God for a sign, any sign, to tell her what happened to her girls. The pastor, an older man with kind eyes, sat with her sometimes, offering words of comfort that barely reached her heart. The seasons changed. Summer turned to fall, then to winter. The snow came early that year, covering the empty roads and the old barn in silence. The Christmas tree in the Carter home stayed up until February because Margaret couldn't bring herself to take it down. 2 unopened presents sat beneath it, one for each of her daughters. By the time spring returned, Robert had moved out. He said he couldn't live in that house anymore. "Everything reminds me of them," he told her. Margaret didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes red and tired. After he left, she packed away the girls' clothes, their drawings, their toys, not because she was ready to let go, but because she couldn't bear to see them every day. Still, she kept their room as it was. Every night she left the small lamp on by the window, just in case the girls came home in the dark. The town eventually went quiet again. The search ended officially after a year, though Margaret never stopped looking. She followed every story, every rumor. When a woman in a nearby state reported seeing two girls who looked like Laura and Denise, Margaret drove 4 hours to find out. It wasn't them. When a drifter was arrested claiming he knew what happened, she went to the courthouse only to learn it was another dead end. The years blended together. Margaret grew older, her hair turning gray at the edges. She kept working at the diner, kept paying her bills, kept living, but always with an emptiness she couldn't fill. People in town stopped bringing up the case. Some whispered that it was better to move on. Others believed the worst. But Margaret never gave up hope. Every Sunday, she sat in the same pew at church, hands clasped tightly in prayer. "Please," she would whisper, "just show me something." She often thought about that morning, the sound of the girls' laughter, the way their bikes wobbled as they rode away. Sometimes she dreamed of them standing by the creek waving. In the dreams, they were always smiling. When she woke up, her pillow was always wet with tears. By the early 1990s, life in Maple Creek had changed. New families moved in, the old diner closed, and the sheriff who had led the investigation retired. Margaret stayed in the same house, living quietly, surrounded by memories. Every few years, she'd get a call from a detective checking in, asking if she had heard anything new. The answer was always no, but inside she still believed the story wasn't over. She couldn't explain it. Just a feeling deep in her chest that one day somehow she'd know the truth. In 1998, she started volunteering at the church more often. She helped clean the pews, arrange flowers, and serve coffee after service. It gave her purpose, something steady to hold on to. People admired her strength, though few knew how much pain she still carried. Then, in 2003, 21 long years after that morning, Margaret's life took an unexpected turn. It was an ordinary Sunday, warm and quiet. The church was nearly full, the choir singing softly. Margaret sat near the back, flipping through the worn Bibles stacked on the pews. She reached for one that looked older, its leather cover cracked with age. When she opened it, something slipped out and fell to the floor. It was a photograph. Margaret bent down and picked it up, and what she saw made her heart stop. Two young women smiled back at her from the picture. They were standing on a beach, arms around each other, the sunlight behind them. The faces were older, different, but something deep inside her recognized them instantly. Her hands began to tremble. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The photo looked new, printed not long ago. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were the words, "God brings back what is lost." Margaret's knees went weak. The room around her seemed to blur. For 21 years she had prayed for a sign, and now, in the most unexpected way, she was holding one. The story that began on that warm July morning in 1982 was about to change forever. For a long moment, Margaret just sat there staring at the photograph in her trembling hands. Her heart thudded in her chest so hard it hurt. The faces in the picture looked older, but their eyes, those same bright eyes she used to see every morning at the breakfast table, hadn't changed. She whispered to herself, "It can't be." The woman sitting next to her noticed something was wrong. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't. She stood up and hurried out of the church, clutching the photo to her chest. Outside, she leaned against the wall, breathing in the cool air. The sound of the choir faded behind her. She stared at the picture again, running her fingers over the words on the back. "God brings back what is lost." Her first thought was that someone was playing a cruel trick, but deep down she didn't believe that. Something about the picture felt real. The sunlight, the way the girls stood together, their familiar smiles. That night, she couldn't sleep. The photo lay on her nightstand, illuminated by the dim light of her bedside lamp. She kept picking it up, staring at it again and again. The faces were older, maybe in their 20s. Could it really be them after all these years? The next morning, she went straight to the police station. The old sheriff who had once led the investigation had long retired, but the department still had her daughter's case file. The new detective on duty, a young man named Officer Nolan, listened carefully as she explained how she'd found the photo. He looked skeptical at first. "Ma'am, people drop all sorts of things in churches," he said gently. "Are you sure this is connected to your case?" Margaret slid the photo across the desk. "Look at them," she said. "Please, just look." He studied the picture for a long moment. Then his expression changed slightly. "These look similar," he admitted. "I'll have someone run an analysis." For the first time in years, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. That afternoon, a detective from the Missing Persons Division took the photo to be analyzed. They compared it with the original pictures from 1982, checking facial features, eye placement, and bone structure. The results came back 2 days later. The match was striking, not certain but enough to reopen the case. When the call came, Margaret's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. The officer told her they were reopening the investigation and needed her to come in for more questions. When she arrived at the station, she saw the old box containing her daughter's case file on the table. Yellowed papers, photographs and notes from decades ago. Seeing it again made her heart ache. The detective asked her everything. When she found the photo, who had access to that church, whether she'd seen anyone unfamiliar there recently. She answered as best she could. The church secretary confirmed that the Bible Margaret picked up had been donated only a few weeks earlier. It had come from a box of used books given by a nearby charity group. That detail changed everything. The police traced the donation back to a small second-hand shop 2 towns over. The shop owner said he received the books from a woman who had recently moved out of state. She hadn't left a forwarding address, but she paid with a check. The name on the check was unfamiliar, but when the police ran it, something caught their attention. The address linked to the check matched a small beach town in Florida. The beach. The same kind of place in the photograph. When Margaret heard this, she felt her knees go weak. Could it really be where her daughters were? The investigation quickly moved forward. Detectives contacted authorities in Florida, sending them copies of the photo and the background details. They began visiting churches and community centers in the area, showing the picture around. For Margaret, the waiting was unbearable. Every ring of the phone made her heart jump. Every day that passed felt longer than the one before. She tried to go about her usual routines, attending church, volunteering, keeping busy, but her mind was always elsewhere. Late one evening, she sat at the kitchen table, the same table where her daughters had once eaten breakfast and laughed about silly things. She looked at the empty chairs and whispered, "If you're out there, please let me find you." Weeks passed before another call came, this time from a Florida detective. He said they might have found something. A church volunteer in a coastal town recognized the girls in the photo. She said they had attended youth retreats there several years earlier under different names. She remembered them clearly, kind, quiet girls who never spoke much about their past. Margaret couldn't breathe when she heard that. Her mind filled with questions. Who were they now? Who had they been living with all these years? Why hadn't they come home? The Florida police began searching records and found 2 women with matching descriptions living under new identities, both in their 30s. The details were astonishing. The women had grown up believing their parents had died in an accident. They had been taken across several states by a man who claimed to be their uncle. He had changed their names, enrolled them in school, and raised them as his own. When he passed away, the women stayed together unaware of their true past. When detectives reached out, they were careful. They didn't want to scare them. A small meeting was arranged at a local community center. Margaret wasn't told right away. The police wanted to be sure first. But when they confirmed that the fingerprints matched the records from 1982, the news finally came. The call came on a Thursday morning. Margaret was sitting by her window drinking tea when the phone rang. She answered softly, expecting another update, maybe another delay. But this time the detective's voice sounded different. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "we found them." The cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. She didn't even notice. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Are you sure?" "We're sure," he said. "They're alive. Margaret couldn't speak for several seconds. She pressed her hand over her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. After 21 years, the words she had prayed to hear had finally come. That night, she packed a small suitcase. The police arranged for her to fly to Florida the next morning. She didn't sleep at all. Her mind was racing. What would she say? Would they remember her? Did they even want to see her? The flight felt endless. She stared out the window the entire time, watching the clouds drift by. When the plane landed, she saw palm trees and felt the warm air against her face. It was a world away from the quiet fields of Maple Creek. At the community center, the detectives greeted her kindly. One of them said, "They're waiting in the next room." Her legs trembled as she walked down the hallway. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own footsteps. She reached the door, and for a moment she couldn't bring herself to open it. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. 2 women were sitting there. When they turned around, the world seemed to stop. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The women looked at her with wide eyes. Confusion, recognition, disbelief all mixed together. Then one of them whispered, "Mom?" It was the same soft voice she used to hear calling from the hallway at night. Margaret broke down in tears. She ran forward and hugged them both, holding them so tightly it was as if she feared they'd disappear again. The 3 of them cried together, the years of pain and loss melting away in that single moment. They sat there for hours, talking, holding hands, trying to make sense of everything. The sisters explained what little they knew, how the man who raised them had told them their parents were gone, how they had never questioned it because they were so young. They had grown up moving from place to place, never understanding the full truth. It wasn't until a few years earlier that they started to wonder. They had found an old newspaper article about 2 missing girls with names they didn't recognize, but faces that felt familiar. They had kept the clipping quietly, unsure what to do. One of them had placed the photo inside a Bible at church as a silent prayer, hoping somehow it would reach the right person. They never imagined it actually would. Margaret listened, tears running down her cheeks. The pain of all those lost years was heavy, but the joy of having them back was stronger. As the sun set outside, she looked at her daughters, no longer the little girls who rode off on their bikes one summer morning, but grown women, alive, real, sitting right in front of her. For the first time in 21 years, Margaret felt whole again. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet thank you. Somewhere deep in her heart, she knew that prayer she had whispered every night for 2 decades had finally been answered. Margaret stayed in Florida for the next few days, unable to take her eyes off her daughters. Even after all the talking, the crying, the long embraces, she still found herself quietly studying their faces when they weren't looking, as if trying to make up for the years she had missed. Every movement, every smile, every word felt like a miracle she didn't want to end. The sisters, now grown women, had built their own small lives. They lived together in a modest apartment near the ocean, worked at local jobs, and attended church every Sunday. They were kind and polite but carried a certain quietness about them, the kind that comes from years of uncertainty. In the beginning, the reunion felt like a dream, too good to be real. They spent hours sitting by the water talking about the past. Margaret told them stories from their childhood, the way they used to race bikes down the hill, the songs she sang to them before bed, the time they painted the dog's fur with watercolors. The sisters listened with tears in their eyes. They didn't remember much from before they were taken, just flashes of images, sounds, smells, a porch swing, the smell of pancakes, a voice calling from the kitchen window. One evening, as the sun went down over the ocean, one of them said softly, "I used to dream of this place. I thought it was just something I made up." Margaret reached over and took her hand. "It wasn't a dream," she said. "It was home." The days were filled with mixed emotions, joy and sadness, love and confusion. Margaret wanted to know everything, how they were taken, who had raised them, what their lives had been like. But she tried not to ask too many questions too soon. She didn't want to push too hard. The detectives handling the case visited them again. They wanted to understand how the girls had disappeared without a trace all those years ago. The sisters explained what they could remember. When they were young, they had trusted the man who took them. He told them their parents were gone and that he was their guardian. He gave them new names, new stories, and moved them from place to place. For a long time, they believed everything he said. When they got older, small things started not to add up. Old memories didn't fit. The man avoided questions about their past. After his death, they began to look for answers. They searched online, went through libraries, and even contacted local archives. When they found an article about two missing sisters from Michigan, they were too scared to believe it might be them. That was when they printed the photo, hoping that somehow, somewhere it would reach the person meant to see it. They didn't know how it ended up in the Bible Margaret picked up, but maybe that was the miracle in it. The detectives reopened the old files. New interviews were conducted, old evidence was rechecked. They traced the man's background, discovering that he had once lived near Maple Creek in the early 1980s. He had done odd jobs in the area, but had left suddenly around the same time the girls vanished. For Margaret, hearing this brought back old pain, but she tried not to dwell on it. What mattered now was that her daughters were safe. She didn't want anger or bitterness to take away from the peace she finally felt. The sisters agreed to visit Michigan, to see the home they had left behind. Margaret spent days cleaning the house even though it was spotless already. She polished the picture frames, washed the curtains, and baked the same kind of bread she used to make when they were children. When they finally arrived, it was a quiet spring morning. The fields were green again, the air smelled of rain, and the porch swing still creaked in the breeze. As they stepped out of the car, the sisters stood still, looking around as if the place itself was calling to something buried deep inside them. "This feels familiar," one of them said softly. They walked slowly through the yard, touching the fence, the tree where they used to hang their tire swing. Inside, Margaret led them to their old room. She had kept it almost the same. The floral wallpaper, the little shelf of storybooks, the small lamp by the window. The sisters ran their hands across the books and toys, silent tears falling down their cheeks. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing the past and present together. That evening, the neighbors came by. Some were older, their hair gray now, but they still remembered the search, the sleepless nights, the heartbreak. Seeing the sisters alive felt like a blessing for the whole town. The local newspaper ran a story. Missing sisters return home after 21 years. People brought flowers and cards to the house. Margaret read every single note, grateful for the kindness that had carried her through the hardest years. But despite the joy, there were still moments of silence that hung heavy in the air. The sisters sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, shaken by dreams they couldn't explain. Margaret would find them sitting in the kitchen sipping tea in the dark. She never pressed them to talk. She just sat beside them holding their hands. Healing wasn't easy. The sisters struggled with guilt, even though they had done nothing wrong. They felt strange being in a town that seemed frozen in time, filled with memories they couldn't fully recall. Margaret knew it would take time for all of them to feel whole again. One afternoon, they visited the church where Margaret had found the photo. The old wooden pews were just as she remembered. The pastor greeted them warmly, though he too looked astonished to see the miracle standing before him. Margaret walked to the same spot where she had first opened the Bible. The sisters stood beside her. She showed them the very page where she had found the photograph. The Bible still sat there, worn and sacred. "It started here," she said quietly. "This was where I found you again." The sisters looked down at the book, and one of them whispered, "Maybe we were never really lost. Maybe we were just waiting for the right time." That night, the three of them sat on the porch together, watching the fireflies flicker across the yard. The sound of crickets filled the air, just like it had that summer night so long ago. For the first time, they could talk openly about everything: the pain, the fear, the years apart. Margaret listened to every word, never interrupting, never judging. She just wanted them to know that they were home now, and that nothing could ever take them away again. As the days turned into weeks, life began to settle into a new kind of normal. Margaret helped her daughters find work nearby. They started attending the local church together. Slowly, laughter began to return to the house, the kind of laughter that had been missing for more than 2 decades. Still, there were quiet moments when Margaret would catch herself staring at the horizon, thinking of how close she had come to never finding them. Sometimes she wondered what made her pick up that old Bible in the first place. Maybe it was chance. maybe something greater. The sisters often said they believed it wasn't coincidence and that something had guided the photograph back to her hands. One of them put it best one evening. "Maybe love has its own way of finding a path," she said. Margaret smiled. "Yes," she whispered, "I believe it does." The police eventually closed the reopened case, listing it as resolved. The man who had taken the girls was gone, and there was no one left to blame. The detectives told Margaret that legally the story was over. But for her, it wasn't about legal endings or police reports. It was about faith, forgiveness, and the quiet power of never giving up. Years later, people in town would still talk about what happened. Some called it a miracle. Others said it was fate. Margaret never tried to explain it. Whenever someone asked, she would smile and say, "Sometimes prayers are answered in ways we can't understand." On quiet evenings, she often sat on that same porch swing with her daughters, now grown and happy, watching the sky turn golden. The pain of the past never fully disappeared, but it no longer defined them. In its place was something stronger, the kind of love that survives time, loss, and distance. And in her heart, Margaret knew that even after all those years of silence, hope had never truly left her. It had simply been waiting, just like her daughters, to find its way home. The weeks after the reunion felt like something out of a dream. For so long, Margaret had imagined what it would be like if her daughters came home. She had pictured hugs, tears, and endless joy. And all of that did happen. But what she hadn't imagined was how complicated it would feel after. Now that they were back in Maple Creek, life began to take on a quiet rhythm again. The townspeople still stopped Margaret in the grocery store or after church, telling her how happy they were for her. Some even cried when they spoke to her. To many people, it was the kind of miracle they had only read about. But behind the smiles and the warm welcomes, there were moments of silence that hung heavy between the three of them. So much time had been lost, 21 years, and that kind of absence couldn't just disappear overnight. Margaret tried her best not to rush anything. She knew her daughters were still trying to find their footing, trying to understand who they were and where they belonged. They were no longer little girls. They were grown women with lives, habits, and memories shaped by someone else. At first, they stayed with her in the old house. It felt comforting but also strange. The room they once shared still carried the faint smell of the lavender soap she used when they were children. Their drawings still hung in faded frames on the wall. The sisters stood looking at them one night, their eyes full of quiet wonder. "It's like time stopped here," one of them said softly. Margaret smiled. "I guess part of me didn't want to move on until you came back." They hugged her, and for a brief moment the weight of the years seemed to lift. Still, there were things none of them knew how to talk about. At breakfast, the air sometimes felt heavy with unspoken questions. Margaret wanted to ask about the man who had taken them, about how they had lived, what they had gone through, but she didn't. Instead, she waited for them to share when they were ready. Slowly, they began to open up. They told her how the man had moved them from town to town, always saying it was for a new start. They said he wasn't cruel, but he kept them isolated, never letting them write letters or make friends easily. He told them stories about a past that didn't exist, that their parents had died, that they were better off starting fresh. The more they talked, the more Margaret realized how much pain they had hidden. But she also realized how strong they had become. They had made a life for themselves despite everything. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, one of them said quietly, "We always wondered if someone out there was missing us." Margaret turned to her, her eyes soft. "Every single day," she said. "Not a morning or night went by that I didn't think of you." Tears welled up in her daughter's eyes. They didn't say anything after that. They didn't need to. A few months later, Margaret suggested they visit the local fair. It was something they used to do as a family before everything changed. At first, they hesitated. The crowds, the noise, the memories, and it was all overwhelming. But eventually, they agreed. When they arrived, the air smelled of popcorn and cotton candy. The carousel played a familiar tune, and children laughed as they ran past. For Margaret, it was a flood of memories. She remembered the summer before they disappeared, how they had begged her to let them go on the Ferris wheel. When they reached that same Ferris wheel again, the sisters smiled at each other. "Do you still like it?" one asked. Margaret laughed softly. "Not as much as I used to, but I'll watch you go." They rode together, and when the wheel reached the top, they looked down at the lights below. The world looked small and calm, and for the first time in years, they felt free. After that day, things began to change in small, beautiful ways. The sisters started working part-time at a nearby shop. They made friends in town and began helping with Sunday service at the church. They even joined the choir, their voices blending softly during hymns. Margaret would sit in the back pew watching them sing, her heart full. Sometimes she closed her eyes and whispered a quiet thank you for everything that had led them here, even the parts she didn't understand. But healing is rarely a straight path. There were days when old wounds reopened, when one of the sisters would wake from a dream crying, or when something small, like a smell or a sound, would bring back a memory they didn't want to remember. On those nights, Margaret didn't try to fix it with words. She would simply sit with them, holding their hands, letting them cry until the silence settled again. One evening, one of them asked, "Do you ever wish it had all been different?" Margaret thought for a moment. "Of course I do," she said softly. "But if wishing could change the past, I would have done that a long time ago. What matters now is that we're here. We found each other again. That's what I hold on to." The sisters nodded, understanding that truth in a way they hadn't before. As the months passed, something beautiful began to happen. The three of them grew not just close, but connected in a new way. They weren't just trying to rebuild what had been lost. They were building something entirely new. They started small traditions together. Every Sunday after church, they'd go for a walk along the creek where the girls used to play. The water still glistened the same way it had years ago. Sometimes they'd bring flowers and throw petals into the current, letting them drift away. "This creek kept our secret all those years," one of them once said. Margaret smiled, "And now it keeps our peace." They also began volunteering together at the local children's center. They said they wanted to help kids who had been through hard times, who needed someone to remind them that love could find them again. Margaret watched with pride as her daughters laughed with the children, teaching them art, reading stories, helping with homework. They had turned their pain into compassion, a kind of quiet strength that inspired everyone around them. Word spread beyond Maple Creek. Reporters reached out again, wanting to tell the story of how the family had reunited. Margaret agreed to one interview, not for fame, but to share a message of hope. She sat in front of the camera, her hands folded in her lap, and said, "Never stop believing in the people you love. Even when it feels impossible, love has a way of finding its way back home." The story touched thousands of people. Letters began arriving from all over, from parents still searching for missing children, from people who had lost faith, from strangers who simply wanted to say thank you. Margaret read every letter. Some made her cry, others made her smile, but all of them reminded her that their story was bigger than just them. It was a story about faith, patience, and the quiet miracles that happen when you least expect them. Over time, the past began to feel more distant. The pain didn't vanish, but it softened. The sisters started calling Margaret Mom again naturally, like it had never stopped. They began making plans, maybe to travel one day, maybe to see the ocean together again as a family. One evening, the three of them sat outside under the stars. The night was cool and the air smelled faintly of lilacs. Margaret looked up at the sky, then at her daughters, and said quietly, "Do you know what I used to pray for every night?" They both shook their heads. "I didn't ask for answers," she said. "I just asked that wherever you were, you'd feel loved. I wanted you to know somehow that I never stopped waiting." One of them leaned her head on Margaret's shoulder. "We felt it," she whispered. "Even when we didn't understand it, we felt it." Margaret smiled through her tears. For the first time in years, the ache in her chest felt light. The fear that had lived there for so long was finally gone. The house that had once felt empty was now full again, full of laughter, conversation, and the simple sounds of life. And sometimes, when the morning sun filtered through the curtains, Margaret would stand in the doorway of her daughter's room and watch them talking, drinking coffee, smiling at each other. It was ordinary, but to her it was everything. The world had taken so much from them, but it had also given something back, something stronger, deeper, and unbreakable. And even though their story had begun with loss, it had become something far more powerful, a story about how love never truly disappears. It only waits quietly, for the moment when it can be found again. The years that followed were gentle ones. The chaos had faded, The noise had softened, and what remained was a quiet kind of peace. It wasn't the life Margaret had once imagined, but it was the one she had learned to cherish. The seasons came and went, marking time in small ways. The smell of spring rain, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot in autumn, the laughter that filled the kitchen on cold winter mornings. For so long the house had been a place of silence and sorrow. Now it was alive again. Her daughters, who had once been strangers in their own home, now moved through the rooms as if they'd never left. The walls, which had once held only memories, now echoed with the sounds of life, soft music, quiet conversations, and sometimes bursts of laughter that made Margaret smile every time. They had grown into remarkable women. They worked, they volunteered, they traveled a little. But no matter where they went, they always came back home for Sunday dinner. That tradition became something sacred, their way of keeping each other close. Every Sunday, Margaret cooked their favorite meal. They would sit at the table, passing dishes, sharing stories, teasing each other gently. It was ordinary, but it was beautiful, because ordinary was something Margaret had prayed for years to have again. Sometimes, after dinner, they'd go for walks down the old road near the woods, the road where their bikes were found all those years ago. At first, Margaret avoided that place, and when it reminded her too much of what she'd lost. But as time went on, it became something else entirely. It became a place of quiet strength, a reminder of how far they'd come. The trees there had grown taller, their branches heavy with age. The air smelled of pine and earth. The sisters would walk beside her, talking softly about life, work, and the little things that made them laugh. And every time they reached the bend in the road, Margaret would stop and take a deep breath. "This is where I last saw you," she once said. "I used to come here and imagine you walking back toward me." One of her daughters took her hand. "And now we finally did," she whispered. Margaret nodded. "You did. You came home." In the months that followed, the family grew even closer. They became part of the town's heartbeat again, known not just for the tragedy that had once surrounded them, but for the hope and light they brought with them. At church, people still talked about that day. The Bible, the photograph, the miracle that started it all. Margaret never got tired of telling it. Not because she liked the attention, but because she knew it gave people hope. Every time she told the story, she spoke softly, carefully. It wasn't just a coincidence, she'd say. It was a reminder that love doesn't disappear. Sometimes it just takes the long way home. Her words touched people deeply. Some even said that after hearing her story, they began to believe again, not just in miracles, but in forgiveness, in patience, in the kind of love that doesn't fade. The sisters often joined her when she spoke at community gatherings. They shared their side of the story, not the painful parts, but the lessons they had learned. They talked about healing, about rebuilding trust, about finding beauty even after being lost for so long. People would often come up to them afterward, crying softly, saying things like, "Your story gave me hope." And every time, the sisters would smile and say, "That's what Mom taught us." For Margaret, hearing those words was everything. She had spent so many years feeling powerless, praying for answers that never came. Now she saw how her pain had turned into something that could help others heal. Still, there were quiet moments when the memories came back. Nights when the house was still and the moonlight fell through the window, and she would find herself thinking about those lost years. Sometimes, she would sit at her kitchen table, the same one she had prayed at all those years ago, and open her old Bible, the same one she had opened that day in church. She kept the photograph inside, pressed between the pages. The edges had worn a little over time, but the image still made her heart swell. She would run her fingers over the handwriting on the back, the words that had changed everything. God brings back what is lost. She never found out who wrote them. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the message was what mattered most. One evening, as she sat reading, one of her daughters came in. She had that same gentle smile that always reminded Margaret of the little girl she used to be. "What are you reading?" she asked. Margaret smiled and closed the Bible softly. "Just remembering," she said. Her daughter sat down across from her. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Margaret thought for a long moment. "I used to," she admitted, "but I don't anymore. Everything that happened, even the hard parts, and brought us to this moment. And this moment is enough for me." They sat together in silence for a while. listening to the quiet hum of the house. That night, before going to bed, Margaret walked through the hallway and paused at a family photo hanging on the wall. It was a new one. The three of them standing in front of the church, smiling, the sun shining behind them. She reached out and touched the frame, whispering, "Thank you." The years continued to pass gently. The sisters built families of their own. They had children who grew up running through the same fields their mothers once played in. The sound of laughter filled the house again, high-pitched giggles, small footsteps, the chaos of family life. Margaret loved being a grandmother. She spoiled the children with homemade cookies and bedtime stories. Sometimes, when she looked at them, she saw glimpses of her daughters as little girls, the same eyes, the same smiles. The sisters often said that Margaret's strength had taught them how to be the kind of mothers they wanted to be. They told their children stories about love, faith, and never giving up. They never told them everything, but they told them enough for them to understand that hope can survive anything. One summer evening, the whole family gathered in the backyard for a small celebration. It had been exactly 25 years since the day Margaret opened that Bible. The air was warm, the sky painted in shades of gold and pink. They grilled food, played music, and shared stories. As the sun dipped below the trees, the children ran around with sparklers, their laughter filling the night. Margaret sat on the porch watching them, her heart full. One of her daughters came over with a plate of food and sat beside her. "You okay, Mom?" Margaret smiled. "More than okay. I'm just thinking how lucky I am." Her daughter leaned her head on her shoulder. "We're the lucky ones." They sat there together, watching the sparks flicker in the air, lighting up the darkness. Later that night, when everyone had gone inside, Margaret stayed out a little longer. The world was quiet now, just the sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves. She looked up at the stars, bright and clear above her. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not one of asking, but of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for bringing them home, for letting me live long enough to see this peace." As she opened her eyes, a soft breeze passed through the yard, rustling the pages of a small notebook that lay beside her. It flipped open to a page where she had once written something long ago, a note she had left for herself during those lonely years. It said, "Never stop believing, even when you can't see the way." Margaret smiled, tears filling her eyes. She didn't need proof anymore. The proof was all around her, in the laughter, in the love, in the life that had been rebuilt from the ashes of sorrow. When she finally went inside, she turned off the lights and paused at the doorway of her daughter's old room. The beds were empty now. Her daughters had homes of their own, but she could still feel their presence there, still hear their voices in the echoes of time. She whispered softly, "Good night, my girls." In that moment, she knew she had found peace, the kind of peace that doesn't come from forgetting, but from forgiving the years that were stolen and embracing the ones that were given back. Life hadn't been perfect, but it had been full of love, lessons, and second chances. And as the moonlight streamed through the window, lighting up the quiet house, Margaret finally rested, her heart whole at last.